Joining the Obama administration in February of 2009, Eric Holder became the first African American to hold the position of Attorney General, and subsequently served as the nation's top attorney until 2015. During his tenure at the helm of the Justice Department, Eric Holder fought for issues of civil rights, race, national security, and marriage equality. Mr. Holder's leadership as Attorney General saw many meaningful shifts in American law and at the Department of Justice. He began the execution of terrorists in civilian federal courts, cementing this approach for future administrations. Further, Holder's Department of Justice strengthened civil rights issues through a vigorous defense of the Voting Rights Act and a successful challenge of controversial immigration laws. Most recently, Mr. Holder's Department of Justice refused to defend the Defense of Marriage Act, citing the unconstitutional nature of the law, resulting in the landmark Supreme Court decision in 2013 striking down the statute. Prior to his service as Attorney General, Mr. Holder has served as the U.S. Deputy Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, and as a judge for the Superior Court of the District of Columbia, bringing with him decades of experience in law and justice to the Obama administration. Moderating the discussion tonight will be David Strauss, University of Chicago professor of law and an editor of the Supreme Court Review. Before coming to the University of Chicago, Professor Strauss was an attorney advisor in the Office of Legal Counsel at the U.S. Department of Justice and was an assistant to the Solicitor General of the United States. So with that, please join me in welcoming Attorney General Eric Holder and Professor David Strauss.
Farewell speech you spoke about voting and the threat to voting rights and how foundational it is to a democracy that people be able to vote. I mean, is this a new threat that we're seeing to voting rights, these sort of ways in which there seem to be systematic efforts to disenfranchise people? Is that new? I mean, on the one hand, you think, look, people have always kind of tried to sort of play around with voting rules, and in Chicago, the vote early and often stuff and all of that, and it's almost kind of a folk history of that. But on the other hand, there's also a very ugly side to vote suppression in the disenfranchisement of African Americans. So is this new, do you think, or is this cyclical, and it's something, it'll spin itself out and we'll be back to kind of a bipartisan consensus that you can win or you lose, but we're going to follow the same rules?
No, I think it's a cyclical thing in that we have seen periods in our history, after Reconstruction, black folks, newly freed, exercise their right to vote, and start sending black people to Congress, senators, and the establishment in the South said, no, we're not going to have that. There's a great book I think you should all read Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman, that talks about what happened in response to that newfound black political power. We saw it in the 20s during the Jim Crow era. I think what we're seeing now is another attempt to somehow disenfranchise or make more difficult the voting process for people of color, for young people, for people who have democratic leanings. Although I think it's cyclical, I don't think this is something that's going to wind itself out. This will only be beaten back by a concerted and consistent effort. And what I tried to do as Attorney General, and what I continue to try to do in my private life. This is something that really I think we need to focus on as a nation. We spend huge amounts of money. We sent the best and brightest, our young people, across oceans to Iraq, for instance. Remember those pictures of people who dipped their hands in purple ink to show that they had voted? This is how important we thought that was. We sent, our young people to sacrifice their lives so that these people might vote. Are we going to deny people the vote here in our own country? I mean, if you look, for instance, at University of Texas statute that we successfully challenged, if you had a photo ID card that showed you had the right to carry a concealed weapon, you could vote. That was a good form of ID. If you had a University of Texas student ID, that was not good. Now think about that. So who does that mean gets to vote and who doesn't get to vote? And that's what these laws are all about. It's not very subtle at all. And then they say, well, if you don't have the photo ID, you can go out and then get the necessary papers. And in Texas, we showed that well, to get the necessary background stuff, to get a birth certificate and other things, it costs $22. Well, wait a minute. So that means you got to spend $22 so you can get the necessary documentation to get the right photo ID. That's a poll tax. You know, you're making people pay in order to cast a ballot. So this is something that I feel, if you haven't noticed, very, very, very strongly about, and I think all of us ought to be concerned, because the right to vote is the cornerstone of our democracy.
I mean, that sounds like the cure is in the courts. Are you confident the courts will come through?
The court certainly didn't come through in the Shelby County decision, which pains me no end that it's Shelby County versus Holder, that my name is somehow associated with the decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act. No, I think it's going to be dependent on the Justice Department to use the remaining parts of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 in particular, to bring cases. You know, the courts, I think, you know, are not going to undo what they did in Shelby County, so we're ultimately going to be looking at a legislative fix if we want to fix the Voting Rights Act. But, you know, with a different Supreme Court and with new cases coming up there, I think there is some chance that the courts can play a more positive role.
Right. Okay, let me ask you about one of the other issues that you said dominated your time to an unexpected degree, which is national security. And there are two aspects of that I wanted to ask you about. One is the amount of time and energy you spent trying to get people suspected of terrorism tried in civilian courts instead of in military courts. And I mean, you've had tremendous success when that has happened, but it hasn't happened a lot.
Yeah.
What accounts for that? Why is this? It seems that everything, once we had some experience trying people in civilian courts and it worked, they got convictions, not that you always want convictions, but they seemed to be fair trials. There were no safety risks. The military commissions, meanwhile, have been stagnant. So why has that not caught on?
All right, one word, politics. You're exactly right. You know, in the Bush administration, in the Obama administration, hundreds of these cases were tried. When I announced that we were going to try Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his Confederates, the people responsible for 9/11, in an Article III court in Manhattan, you know, you would have thought I said I'm going to go and kill my mother or something like that, you know, in spite of the fact that there was this track record of trying these cases, doing so in a safe way and not endangering communities in which these trials occurred. Politicians found that there was a good line that they could use, which was to say, oh, you're going to give these terrorists the same rights that you would give an average American citizen, which makes, I don't quite understand that, but it had a resonance. And as a result, opposition to the decision to try them in Manhattan was formulated and then became so effective that I ultimately had to reverse that decision. But now that I'm no longer Attorney General, I can say this: I was 100% right. They were 100% wrong. If Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his Confederates had been tried in Article III court in Manhattan, as I said they should have been, they would have been convicted and probably would have been on death row right now, as opposed to sitting in Guantanamo at the cost of, I think, like $2 million per year with no prospects that there is a trial for the people who were responsible for the single greatest terrorist attack in the history of this nation. 100% right, 100% wrong.
Do you think the wrong view reflected a legitimate, if irrational, concern, or do you think it was just a stick to beat you and the president about the head and shoulders?
No, it was just a stick. You know, it was a political stick. I remember hearing that one senator said that it was the biggest applause line that she got during her campaign when she said, "We're not going to let these terrorists get access to our courts and get the same rights that you would get." I'm thinking, well, the same rights that you would get, like if you destroyed a building,
right, if you
fly. I
committed
mean, you know,
terrorist
like, we're not talking about innocent people who end up in front of, judges and juries. These are people who committed, heinous crimes. But so I think it was all politics. But I think that's the danger, as I said earlier. This is what happens when politicians put their noses into criminal justice matters. The results just are not good.
Let me ask you about another side of the national security debate, which is leak investigations. And you and the president have been challenged by people who would ordinarily maybe be your friends for being overly aggressive in prosecuting leaks. And I think they say, the Bush administration was more aggressive than any previous administration, and the Obama administration has been more aggressive even than the Bush administration, somehow measured. Do they have a point?
No. I know you're shocked to hear me say that. No, I don't think so. I mean, first off, more prosecutions than any other administration. I think that we had a total of 5 or 6, so you have to keep in mind that's the number. These prosecutions were brought against people who had broken oaths to keep things secret and put at risk the American people. One of the cases I can talk about, because it has been reported, involved a guy who, for whatever reason, decided to tell a reporter information that had compromised a British operation that put us close to the bomber for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. A guy who was, famous for the Detroit bombing attempt, trying to put printers on airplanes. We were close to that guy. And as a result of that leak, we were not close. We became blind as to where he was. So there were consequences to these leaks. I think we were pretty selective in the cases that we brought. There's also, in this technological world in which we now live, the ability to make these cases that we didn't have before because of emails and all of that stuff. You can find documentary proof of the interactions that were inappropriate. Now, having said all that, I was a little concerned that the media guidelines that we had that talked about the interaction between the Justice Department or the executive branch and the media were outdated. They'd not been changed for like 35 years. And so we got together with a group of people from the media and redid them. And I think the present Attorney General and Attorney Generals going forward will have a better system to work with as they make these prosecutive determinations about bringing leak cases.
This is as far as investigating the media themselves as opposed to the leaker.
Yeah, and I think what should be clear, I want to make clear, is that we never brought a case against a reporter. I mean, what I said in a congressional testimony, I guess the first time, and repeated over and over again, was that as long as I was Attorney General, no reporter was ever going to go to jail for doing what reporters do. Our focus was on people who had done the leaking, and as I said, broken oaths that they had taken. A reporter who took leaked information and wrote a story was not going to get prosecuted, never was prosecuted by anybody in the Obama administration.
Mm-hmm. When you were deciding which leaks to prosecute, what kinds of things did you think about? I mean, if someone had genuinely been motivated by conscience and thought they were revealing an abuse as opposed to someone who was just acting recklessly, was that the sort of thing would you sort of give a pass to someone if you thought, well, you shouldn't have done this, you did break your oath, but I understand the motivation and it came from someplace, some kind of good faith? Would that be a factor?
Yeah, there's a whole variety of factors that you take into consideration. People who were genuinely whistleblowers, for instance, bringing to the attention of the press inappropriate things that were happening in a particular agency, that would not be the kind of case that we would bring. On the other hand, it's not up to an individual to decide, what's right and what's wrong. There are a variety of ways in which you can bring to the attention of people within your agency, and if that doesn't work, then outside your agency, even to Congress, concerns you have about the way in which things are done. But you take into account a variety of things. I mean, we got, scores of cases referred to us by the intelligence community that we decided not to bring, sometimes to the dismay of the head of the CIA or the National Security Director. I mean, upset with the determination that we made at Justice not to bring cases. So not every case that was sent to us did we investigate, and then we did indict. The number that we brought was actually a really small portion of the number that were actually referred to us.
Mm-hmm. We were talking backstage about how kids these days don't know about the Vietnam War, apparently don't know about the Beatles. There's a book back there that sort of is a history of who are the Beatles, which we thought, how can you, what?
Which was shocking and distressing,
Yes,
so, 4 kids from England, have you all heard about them? Yes.
At the risk of losing that segment of the audience, would you have prosecuted Daniel Ellsberg?
Ooh. I think probably not, I think given what he shared that showed the Nixon administration, going over the line. I'd have taken a lot of grief for that one, but I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, because again, that was revealing wrongdoing. Now, I'd have to look back and see what the national security consequences were of that and what the impact was. For instance, you haven't asked, but Snowden, for instance, he's somebody I think, we would prosecute. I mean, I think that his raising those issues engendered a national debate that I think was good for the country to ask. So we asked, as the president has said, simply because we can do something in terms of surveillance, should we do it? I think that in large part was raised by Snowden's actions. But the national security consequences of what Snowden did were very, very severe. Blinded us in certain areas, put at risk some of our intelligence agents, harmed relationships that we had with cooperating countries. There was a real consequence to what he did. And so I think that were he to come back, a prosecution of him would be appropriate. That should take into, a determination is made as to what an appropriate charging document looks like or what sentence would be sought. That should take into account the full range of the consequences of what he did, both negative and positive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about another issue that's played a role in your time as Attorney General and is also very important here in Chicago, which is police-community relations, and both the allegations of police abuses and what seems to be a spike in serious crime rates in certain major cities for reasons that really no one knows. I guess my question is this. I mean, so much of this seems to reflect local conditions. Training, culture in the police department. Some of this happens in small towns where you suspect there's deficient training. Even in big cities, a lot depends on the particular culture of the police force. Is there a federal role in this? Was this something that you thought you could play a role other than by saying the right things?
Yeah, I mean, we brought record numbers of cases against police departments for their inappropriate use of force. And I think one of the things you said in your question is right. And I think a lot of it has to do with training and culture. Police departments want to conduct themselves, by and large, in the right way. Police officers want to do things the right way. You want to make sure that there is trust between people in law enforcement and the communities that they are supposed to protect. And without that trust, you don't have a good relationship, and you don't then have good law enforcement. People are reluctant to share information. You even see it on juries. People, don't believe police officers when they serve on juries. So breaking down cultures, giving adequate training. Those are the reasons why we brought, as I said, these record numbers of cases with the hope that we would settle them and then put in place corrective measures so these police departments would be better than when we found them.
And this was a response to reports of abuses by the police that you could bring these lawsuits?
Yeah, I mean, as you monitor a variety of things, everything from the media to community groups to letters that are coming in from the department. You look at statistical things to decide where our limited resources in the Civil Rights Division should be deployed. The Civil Rights Division can't be in every police department where there is a problem, but you can go after those that are perhaps the most egregious or that have some kind of regional impact, with a thought that other departments will see what happened and see the changes that were made and then try to emulate what we did through the civil action that we brought as part of the civil rights enforcement effort.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a less reactive role for the federal government potentially? I mean, maybe not as it's currently constituted, but there used to be something called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration that I think tried to fund, sort of get in ahead of time, and rather than waiting for reports of abuses, really sort of try to set up systems that would work. I don't know what's happened to that, or if that's...
No, actually, that's a very good question, and it's actually one of the things we thought about, because we thought, all right, we're bringing these record numbers of cases. We don't have the resources, and so we started something in the COPS office, the Community-Oriented Policing Service, that really doles out money to police departments, and said, under the leadership of the head of the COPS office, We went to Las Vegas, that was one place, and to a couple of other cities where we said, look, before we get to a point where we have to bring a civil rights action, let's look at the issues, the problems that you all have, and let's work cooperatively to try to figure out a way in which we can nip this problem in the bud or deal with problems that exist. And I think as word of that has spread, police departments are, I think they like that idea of working cooperatively with the federal government. That does not, it's not as resource intense. We can use actually other police departments as part of the effort. Police departments that are doing things right, put them in touch with a police department that's having some issues. So we're trying to get back to doing things in two ways, to have the cooperative, collaborative approach through the cops office, but also reserving the right to bring cases through the Civil Rights Division.
Do you think that forward-looking cooperative approach, as you described, do you think that's underfunded? Is that something that, going forward really deserves more emphasis?
Yeah, as a former Attorney General, I think everything in the Department of Justice was underfunded. But I think that's actually one where I think, for the money that you invest, the return is, exponentially better. To build that relationship, to build the bonds that have to exist between law enforcement and the communities that they serve is almost incalculable. But it means that people are safer. It means that people look at police officers in ways that they should. It means that police officers look at communities in ways that they should. The quality of life for neighborhoods and for police officers just goes up. Crime rates tend to go down. So yeah, investing money in both the collaborative approach and the civil rights enforcement approach, I think is money well spent.
Right. I mean, it seems perverse, really, to invest enormous resources after the fact, after something terrible has happened, to try to punish the police officers, when for a fraction you could prevent it from happening and
right.
not have that.
And that's one of the things in the whole criminal justice sphere that we've tried to emphasize, this whole notion of prevention money. The problem is that spending money on prevention is not something where you see results in the course of a 2-year congressional cycle, a 6-year senatorial cycle. Sometimes you don't see the results for 5, 10 years as a generation, ages goes from, 6, 7, 8 years old through their teen years until their early adult years. But there's no question that all the research shows us that prevention is the best way to do it. It's not a coincidence that you see the greatest amount of violent crime where you see the greatest amount of social dysfunction. We see schools that don't educate. We see high rates of unemployment. Dealing with those causative things is really the way to get at these long-term and long-standing criminal issues that we as a nation have been faced with for centuries.
Right. Do you have a view of the Ferguson effect, so-called?
Jim Comey is a friend and a person for whom I have the greatest respect. I was instrumental in his selection as FBI director, but I think he's got it totally wrong. I don't think that there's any statistical proof that shows that there is the Ferguson effect, that this focusing on police departments has necessarily meant that police are reluctant to do their jobs, because that's in essence what I think he's saying, or that there is a connection between an increased crime rate in certain parts of the country as a result of the so-called Ferguson effect. I simply don't think that it exists.
We have to break for questions. Well, one last question to you. Complete the following sentence. You only get a few words. Eric Holder was the Attorney General who?
Who? Okay. Okay. Eric Holder was the Attorney General who returned the department to its great traditions and left the department better than he found it.
Freed. Thank you. And now we'll take questions. I'm under strict orders that the first several questions are to come from students.
Hi, Attorney General Eric Holder, and good to see you, Professor Strauss. We had elements together. I'm sure you remember.
I do remember.
We had, what do you say?
So I'm curious about what you think of the government's response to the attacks on the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, and whether you would have done anything differently, and what we might do to deter similar attacks in the future. Thank you.
Okay, I can't, attacks on, I didn't hear.
The
think
Malheur Wildlife Refuge in Oregon?
Okay. You mean, well, I think, if we're talking about the same thing, I think that the government handled it, I think, pretty well by not rushing in and, you know, having a Waco kind of scenario unfold. Patience, isolation, and then ultimate resolution. I think that's the way to go. That was a painful lesson that Attorney General Reno learned, you know, in Waco. But to be fair, I mean, there were, you know, allegations of child abuse and all of that stuff. But patience, the use of patience in law enforcement is always a good thing.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us. Since the recent San Bernardino shootings, there's been a nationwide conversation about whether Apple should be compelled to build a backdoor into its devices, and would you be in favor of prosecuting technology companies like Apple should they refuse to comply in this way?
Yeah, I don't think there's a basis, a statutory basis to prosecute them for that. But I think that that is, you know, the issues that Tim Cook raised and, you know, others in the tech community raised, I think are significant ones. You know, the notion of privacy in the 21st century, we all have, you know, iPhones. Some of you, unfortunately, have, you know, Android devices. We all have iPhones, and, you know, there's so much stored on my phone, you know. I don't like the notion that, you know, that which I'd like to keep private can somehow be made public. And I guess the concern I also have is one that, again, Tim Cook raised. You know, if you build a back door so that law enforcement can legitimately exploit it through the use of a court order, I mean, how likely is it that some foreign government, you know, inimical to our beliefs is going to use it? Some hackers are going to figure out how to get into the back door. I don't know if you can make a secure back door, you know. And so I think the issues, the concerns that they raise are extremely legitimate. Now, I understand the law enforcement concern, the desire to be able to get into iPhones, but I also think that there are a whole variety of ways that have not been discussed, and appropriately, to, you know, get access to information on these devices. So I think that I would probably align myself a little more with Tim Cook and the Apple side.
Hello. One of President Obama's proposed legislation that has been repeatedly thwarted has been gun control and gun safety.
Right.
If a Democrat is elected in our next election, in the November election, what advice would you give them in hopefully moving forward any sort of gun control, gun safety legislation?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask me what my biggest failure was, I'd say that the inability to pass meaningful, reasonable gun safety legislation would be that. My worst day as Attorney General was the day that I went to Sandy Hook, the elementary school, and met with a bunch of first responders and crime scene search officers, you know, grizzled 20, 30-year veterans. And we were all in tears as we walked around that school and saw, you know, blood on the walls, places where the bullets had entered the carpet, juxtaposed with these, you know, things that little kids write when this is what I'm going to do in first grade this year. I want to learn how to spell or something, and the letters are, you know, the wrong way. I mean, these cute things. I mean, if America had been with me that day, that gun safety legislation would have become law. What I would advise the next president is to stick with it. You know, we have seen every time there's been a successful effort at beating the gun lobby, it's taken time. When Lyndon Johnson signed, I guess, a gun safety bill, 68, 67, something like that, he complained about the fact that what he was signing had been watered down by the gun lobby. So this goes back, you know, for years, and there have been unsuccessful attempts up to that point, and been unsuccessful up to now. But I think this is an interesting thing, and this is something I think the American people really have to focus on in this election. Hillary Clinton has really put it out there and said, this is where I am. I mean, she's not saying, she says, yeah, I respect Second Amendment rights, but she's also saying a part of my administration, a part of the effort I'm going to use as President of the United States is to promote gun safety, reasonable gun safety legislation. You saw Donald Trump getting the endorsement of the NRA yesterday, or the day before yesterday, something like that. So there's a stark choice here. And I think Secretary Clinton has put it out there in a way that I don't think any presidential candidate has before. I mean, if she's elected, this is what is going to be a focus of hers. The reality is that the vast majority of people in this country support it. But the majority of the members of the NRA support reasonable gun safety measures. And so I think we just have to keep pushing. It will ultimately happen. My fear is that it will take another Sandy Hook or something like that to move the people in Congress to do that which is ultimately right.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a two-part question. I'm an attorney. I practice out of state. And I was involved in a case where there was a rogue federal prosecutor, basically, who cut corners, indicted people who really should not have been indicted. The case was eventually thrown out of court. The judge mentioning that, look, we've been here 12 days, I haven't even heard any evidence. And you hid 600 pages of Giglio and Brady material. So a two-part question, really, with regard to this. First off, since most cases end with a plea agreement, would you support the idea of having an open file system prior to accepting any plea agreement, obviously redacting any confidential witnesses or things like that for their safety? And second of all, the bringing of an indictment, even more so than a conviction, is what ruins a person's life. And the DOJ's website proudly presents a press release of that person being indicted. When a case is thrown out of court, there is no press release saying, we messed up. And I'm wondering if you would also support a provision or a way of removing those press releases or adding a press release later on when it is a case of prosecutorial misconduct.
Yeah. Well, I've got mixed emotions about open file discovery. I mean, I can see theoretically how that would be a useful thing. I get concerned about, and to be fair to your question, you talked about redacting certain things, and I think if you had those redactions or the withholding of certain information that might put people at risk who cooperated with the government, I'm not so sure that my opposition to open file discovery would be, I might not have, opposition to open file discovery. I mean, I think the process is generally better served by as much transparency as is possible. But here's one thing I'd say, the discovery rules run two ways. And very often, the government's got the burden, but there is supposed to be discovery. If we're going to have discovery, I think that we should have reciprocal discovery, real reciprocal discovery, so that a criminal trial, actually becomes a search for truth as opposed to just a contest. Now, there's always going to be an element of that, who's got the better lawyers and all of that. But if there's going to be open file discovery, I think there has to be more willingness on the part of the defense to reveal things as well. I guess with regard to the press releases, it is true that in significant cases, I mean, the Justice Department indicts, thousands of cases, I don't know, per year. The number of press releases that go out, I would think, is only a fraction of those, and certainly it's in the more high-profile cases. In those cases where the government fails to convict in those high-profile matters, I think they are generally, pretty much covered by the media, and the failure of the prosecution to meet its burden generally gets talked about, examined, dissected. So I'm not so sure that there's the need for the department to do much more than that. I mean, the prosecution of the police officer in Baltimore, I guess he was acquitted, I think, today, there will be a very, I suspect, very intense media examination of that prosecution effort and speculation as to what the prospects of success are for the prosecutions that are kind of in line to occur.
There are cases, however, that are lower level than that and are not national news, but still have the same effect of harming a person or destroying a person's reputation. In some cases, at least, and I'm not besmirching most prosecutors, but there are some who do things that aren't proper.
Yeah.
And in those cases, people's reputations and lives and livelihoods are destroyed with basically no retribution.
No, I mean, there's no question. Prosecutors have enormous power. This is what I told everybody in the Justice Department. You have enormous amounts of power as a prosecutor, or even as a person who works on the civil side. And with that power comes a huge amount of responsibility, that you use that power appropriately. If people have acted inappropriately, it is incumbent upon people in the Justice Department to hold those people accountable. I dismissed a case against Senator Ted Stevens after he had been convicted, when I was convinced that we withheld information that might have been useful to the defense. That's the kind of thing that a U.S. attorney, an attorney general, I think has to do if their Department of Justice is going to seem credible in the eyes of the people it's supposed to serve.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to speak with us, sir. So in Shelby County v. Holder, Section 4 of the VRA was struck down, which essentially took the power out of Section 5. And I know you were saying that the Justice Department can use Section 2 still to protect voting rights, but to my understanding, it hasn't been as effective as Section 5. So do you think it's possible to either have Congress rewrite Section 4 or to use a case such as South Carolina v. Katzenbach to then somehow support some other part of the VRA or create new legislation to protect voting rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best solution is to come up with a new coverage formula. The court, I think inappropriately, wrongly, in a disconnected way, struck down the VRA. But Supreme Court gets to make those calls. The best thing, Congressman Sensenbrenner, Congressman Conyers have worked on a bipartisan bill that would change the coverage formula. And in some ways, I can understand it. We shouldn't be just focused on the South, because a lot of the inappropriate electoral tactics are now found in the North as well. Wisconsin, Ohio, there are things there that I think probably would have been stopped if the Justice Department had the ability under the old Voting Rights Act. So I think congressional action would be the best way to do this. Now, it's hard for me to imagine that this is going to happen, at least as Congress is presently constituted, where one of the parties thinks that, because the Supreme Court's kind of given them the freedom to do so, one of the parties thinks it's to its political advantage to have these voter suppression statutes in effect. Section 2 is not as effective as the other sections that were struck. The other section that was struck down because we had the ability under the old law to stop things before they happen. To say, all right, you're a covered section, you're a covered community, you're trying to do this. Prove to us that this is not going to have a discriminatory effect. Under Section 2, you're doing things after the fact, and that necessarily means that, or could mean, that there's been a negative consequence that you're trying to prevent from happening in the future, but that has already occurred. And it really worries me about the 2016 election. This is the first presidential election we've ever had without the protection of the Voting Rights Act. And with these statutes that have been put in place in, I think, 21, 22 states, just by coincidence, we have Republican legislatures and Republican governors, just by coincidence. It worries me about what the impact will be where the vote is suppressed. And you don't have to, we have these razor-thin margins in elections, in where a state goes in a presidential election or for a senator. And if you suppress the vote by 2, 3, 4%, something like that, that could be a consequential thing.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for coming. I actually went to Stuyvesant High School too. I'm a fan of the environment.
Stuyvesant High School, New York City.
Yeah. I'm a fan of the environment, and
there are kind of like
Fan of the department.
with the
Okay.
with like the recent removal of the mercury air toxin standards, with kind of an increase in like environmental racism, like pollution being in lower income like minority neighborhoods. I was just wondering what you believe is the future of kind of environmental legislation, and especially with the different candidates having vastly different approaches to things such as climate change, things such as confronting environmental issues, in the 21st century. What you believe would be the future of, or what you imagine would be the future of environmental legislation and kind of a national approach to confronting environmental issues.
Yeah. I mean, there are a few things that I am proud of that we did in the department. One of the things that doesn't get, I think, enough attention is what we did with regard to the environment, the record numbers of cases we brought, record numbers of fines that we got, all with the thought that we had to protect the environment. And I think there's something under that, that is kind of serves as the foundation. There has to be a recognition by all thinking people that climate change is real, okay? That's a basic thing, It's this science. It's science. It's facts. It's not coincidence that we have, the temperatures are going up. We're having record numbers of record high temperatures over year after year. And we're seeing the impact of this around the world. One party has, for whatever reason, you got some senator who walks on the Senate floor with a snowball and says, hey, look, there's no such thing as climate change. We got snow in Washington, D.C. It's like, really? This is the level of discourse that we've gotten here when, all the climatologists, all the scientists say, we're having a negative impact and we've got to reverse this. There's a role, I think, for the Justice Department to play in that. But there's also got to be a dissociation from, let's say it, the Republican Party from the fossil fuel industry, The Koch brothers don't give money without an expectation, even though they've got these nice gauzy ads now, the Koch brothers, we are Koch. Yeah, we are Koch. We are Koch. You drill oil, man. You're into fossil fuels. That's having a negative impact on the planet. Republican Party, conservatives have aligned themselves with those folks. Meaningful legislation, I think, ultimately will occur when an aroused American public holds people accountable, when people start to see the impact. When you have droughts in California that go on for extended periods of time, when you have wildfires that start way sooner than they've had before, when you have hurricanes on the East Coast that are more intense, when you see, through Department of Defense analysis that this is going to cause instability around the world and that this is something that will be a national security issue. All these things have to come together to break that tie between the energy sources of the past and so we can get to the energy sources of the future. Justice Department, I think, can play a role in that, but I think there's a larger context that has to be changed.
Hi, Attorney Holder. I know you were talking about the Justice Department being more apolitical. I was wondering if you had an opinion on the makeup of the Supreme Court right now, as well as the most recent ruling on the Georgia man who was found not guilty for the bias, and Justice Thomas's opinion as well, I guess, at the end of it.
Yeah. Supreme Court is split now, 4-4. Ideological conservatives, ideological progressives. The fact that we have a 4-4 court is, I think, an indictment of, the system. It's an example of the dysfunction that we have in Washington, D.C. This president he's very early in his last year, has nominated an extremely qualified person who was praised by Republicans before when he was up to be nominated to the Court of Appeals in the D.C. Circuit. But I think people see what's going on here. Republicans see what's happening here. Conservatives see what's happening here. The ideological makeup of the court is potentially going to be changed. You would have a Supreme Court that would have Antonin Scalia replaced by Merrick Garland, who's a moderate, I think. But that changes the court from, presumptively 5-4 conservative to probably 5-4 progressive. And that's what, this fight is all about. There have been more Republican-nominated justices serving in the last 35, 40 years, something like that, than democratically appointed justices. And I think, Republicans, conservatives have gotten used to the fact that they see the court as kind of theirs. Well, things change, times change. The Supreme Court is going to change if Merrick Garland is confirmed or if Hillary Clinton is elected. And that's why I think, we're not seeing the vote now. Senator Harkin here, it'd be interesting to hear what he would say about what the prospects are for Merrick Garland over the course of this next year. But my hope is that he will be confirmed. I've known him for a long time. He's a great judge. He'll be a great justice. And you should have stayed in Congress because you could have made it happen. I'm just kidding. This is truly one of the great senators of our time, a person who was forward-leaning, forward-thinking, not afraid of asking tough questions. A person who was a Democrat but held Democrats accountable. Never a person who, you went before and thought, well, Democrat, same party, it was going to be easy questioning. No, that wasn't Tom Harkin. It was, it could have been a little easier, but it wasn't. I have great respect for you, sir, and for your service to our nation.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and after this question and answer, I'm going to have to ask you all to remain seated, please, while Attorney General Holder leaves.
Thank you very much for coming out to speak with us. In response to your discussion about voter rights suppression and the idea of slavery by another name, I guess I'm interested to hear from you if there's a country in the world that you believe provides a better model for ensuring that everyone's voice is heard, and if so, what are some limitations of trying to apply such a model to the United States?
A country that has a better model of?
For ensuring that everyone's voice is heard.
No, I don't know. I think that, I think this is the greatest country in the world. I mean, no, don't ever take any criticism that I have of the system as an indictment of this nation, I think this country is unique. It is truly exceptional. And one of the things I think is great about this nation is that we have the ability to question, America is at its best when it asks questions of itself, when it has the ability to criticize itself, when it uses that criticism as the basis for positive change. We were born with the original sin of slavery. We changed that. The arc of American history has been to include more people, giving women the right to vote, freed slaves, young people. The arc has always been, as I said, one that is towards progress. Doesn't mean there haven't been setbacks. Doesn't mean that there haven't been problems along the way. But no, I'm proud to be an American. I love this country. I think about all the things that have happened to African Americans in our time here in this nation. I think about my own father, who I don't think anybody could have loved this country more. He served, he enlisted in the Army, at the age of 41, 42, something like that, in World War II when he didn't have to. As he says, he never was sent overseas, but he said the Germans and the Japanese never got to this country, so he did his job well. So, he was in Oklahoma and he was in North Carolina, and while he was in uniform, he was discriminated against, told to go to the back of a lunch counter, told to go to the back of a train. And in spite of that, and people like him, felt a love for this country. He was an immigrant that I think people have to understand. And I'm his son, I'm his son. And the love that he felt, the intensity of the love that he felt for this country is mirrored by me, in spite of the problems that I see. I'm always hopeful that this country, as good as it is, can be made better. It's what I've tried to commit my life to. It's what I think you have to commit your lives to. You can't be passive in this fight for progress. You've always got to, ask tough questions, be able to face hard truths, and be prepared to engage. You can't sit back. You just can't sit back. Because if you sit back, I was talking to a group of students earlier, if you sit back, people who are less qualified, less idealistic, less concerned about the welfare of the nation will be the ones who will be pulling the levers of power. And that's why I think, good thinking, right-minded Americans should be engaged in our process. I'm not cynical, you know. I think progress happens when people engage. And this is a noisy country, you know. We have big disagreements with each other, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing. It makes this country unique. What makes it exceptional. But it's only going to stay unique and stay exceptional if the citizens of this country demand things from their leaders and stay involved themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.